At the wedding, the wealthy guests mocked the groom's poor father, but when the old man took the microphone, everyone fell silent. The morning sun appeared on the horizon of the Phillips estate, painting the vast coffee fields that stretched as far as the eye could see in a golden hue. Donovan Cooper, a young man with a firm gaze and calloused hands, worked alongside his father Michael, pruning the plants that had sustained the family for generations. Since childhood, Donovan had known the rhythm of this place, the seasons that dictated the planting and harvesting, and above all, the ever-imposing presence of the Phillips family. Michael, though a man of few words, had always been proud of his son. Donovan had grown up quickly, with the strength and determination that the work demanded. But there was something else that filled Michael's heart with unease: Donovan's closeness to Marina Phillips, the estate owner's daughter. Since they were children, Donovan and Marina had run through the fields, playing among the branches of the trees and along the banks of the small stream that crossed the land. What began as an innocent friendship, however, had transformed. Now, at 20 years old, Donovan found himself deeply in love with Marina, and the feeling was mutual. Marina, with her long brown hair and bright eyes, had always been attracted to Donovan's simplicity and strength of character. Unlike the city people who often surrounded her, Donovan didn't seek status or wealth. He was genuine, and that charmed Marina. They saw each other in secret, walking through the fields at sunset and making promises of a future together, knowing that this future would be complicated. Francis Phillips, Marina's father, however, was beginning to notice the growing bond between the two. A commanding man, used to controlling everything around him, he would never allow his daughter, the heiress to one of the largest fortunes in the region, to get involved with someone of such a lower social class. Donovan was a good worker, no doubt, but to Francis he was, and always would be, just another employee. One morning, while working alongside his father, Donovan sensed the atmosphere growing tense. Francis approached on horseback with a stern expression on his face. His eyes were hard, and as he dismounted from his horse, he called Donovan aside, completely ignoring Michael, as if the man weren't even there. "Donovan," Francis said in an authoritative tone, "I've been watching your behavior. I know you and my daughter have been spending a lot of time together." Donovan tensed, trying to remain calm as he looked at the man. He knew this moment would come sooner or later. "Marina and I have been friends for years," Donovan responded, keeping his gaze steady. "We always have been." Francis narrowed his eyes, as if evaluating every word. He stepped closer to Donovan, his voice low and threatening. "Friends. I'm not a fool, boy. I know there's more than friendship between you two. Let me be clear, this has to stop. If you don't stay away from Marina, both you and your father will be out on the street before the day is over." The threat hung in the air, heavy like an impending storm. Donovan felt his blood boil but held back. He knew he couldn't react impulsively, as that would ruin everything. He needed time. He needed to find a way to resolve this without harming himself or his father. "I understand, sir," Donovan replied, lowering his gaze, though his hands were clenched into fists. Francis cast one final look of disdain before mounting his horse again and riding off, leaving Donovan in a whirlwind of thoughts. He knew Francis wasn't joking. The man was relentless, and if he said he would fire them, he would do so without hesitation. Later, when he returned to the small house at the back of the estate, Donovan vented to his father. Michael, sitting at the worn wooden table, listened in silence. In the end, he let out a long sigh. "Son, I know you love Marina, but those people, they're dangerous when they feel threatened. Francis has more power than you can imagine. If he wants, he can end our lives in the blink of an eye." Donovan knew his father was right, but the love he felt for Marina was stronger than any threat. They had been through so much together, he couldn't just give up. That night, as silence enveloped the house, Donovan made a decision. He was going to see this through to the end, no matter what happened. Only he didn't know that this choice would bring consequences far greater than he could imagine. The day began like any other on the Phillips estate, with workers scattered across the fields, each attending to their usual tasks. However, for Donovan, the weight of his conversation with Francis from the previous morning still hung over him like a dark cloud. The young man tried to focus on his work, but the words of the threat played over and over in his mind. If you don't stay away from Marina, both you and your father will be out on the street. The tension on the estate was palpable, and it didn't take long before Francis decided to escalate his actions. The boss no longer hid his displeasure, and that morning he took things further. As soon as he arrived at the estate headquarters, mounted on his imposing horse, Francis found Donovan near the barn. He was no longer willing to let things continue as they were. "Donovan!" Francis shouted, dismounting with fury evident in his eyes. "How many times do I have to tell you to stay away from my daughter?" Donovan looked up, meeting Francis's gaze. He had spent a sleepless night thinking about what to do, but he knew he couldn't back down. His love for Marina was genuine, and he wouldn't be easily intimidated. "Mr. Francis, with all due respect," Donovan began, trying to keep his voice calm, "Marina has the right to choose who she wants to be with, and I love your daughter." The words had barely left Donovan's mouth when Francis advanced toward him, approaching menacingly. Francis's face twisted with rage as he spoke through gritted teeth. "You're a naive young man, Donovan. You have no idea what you're getting yourself into. Do you think love can sustain you? Do you think it can protect her from the world we live in?" Francis stepped forward, cornering Donovan against the barn wall. "I warned you once, and now I'm warning you for the last time. If you don't stay away from Marina, you will be fired, and not just you, your father as well." The mention of Michael made Donovan clench his fists. He knew his father relied on that job. It wouldn't just be him suffering the consequences, but also Michael, who had dedicated years to the estate. Donovan's heart pounded, a mix of fear and anger coursing through his veins. He felt the crushing pressure but wasn't willing to abandon Marina. As the tension grew, the situation at the estate's main house was no different. When Marina learned that her father had confronted Donovan again, she descended the stairs with determined steps. Upon finding Francis in the yard, she already knew she would have to take a stand. "Dad!" she shouted, her voice firm and her eyes blazing. "What do you think you're doing?" Francis turned to his daughter, surprised to see that she had overheard part of the conversation. Marina approached with determination, unafraid of the man she had always admired and respected. Her love for Donovan made her feel braver than ever. "I've already said it," Marina continued. "I love Donovan. I'm not going to give him up, no matter what you do." Francis shook his head in disbelief at his daughter's audacity. He had always expected Marina to follow the family's plans, to marry someone of equal standing, not a mere employee. "You're playing with fire, Marina," Francis said, now with a more serious tone, as if warning his daughter of an invisible danger. "That boy is not for you. He'll never be able to give you the life you deserve. He's going to ruin everything." But Marina didn't back down. Her eyes sparkled with a mixture of tears and determination. The decision had already been made, and she knew she couldn't live as a prisoner to Francis's expectations. At the same time, the weight of loyalty to her family crushed her, creating an internal conflict that tore her apart, but her love for Donovan was stronger. "I'm not the one ruining everything, Dad," Marina said, her voice cracking. "You are. Your greed, your pride. You're pushing me away, and that won't change what I feel for Donovan." Francis was furious, but before he could respond, Michael appeared in the yard, sensing the tense atmosphere. He had overheard Francis's threats and felt the need to protect his son. Approaching cautiously, Michael caught Francis's attention. "Mr. Francis, I know you're worried about your daughter, but Donovan is a good boy. He would never do anything to harm her," Michael said calmly, trying to diffuse the situation. Francis looked at Michael with disdain, as if the man were insignificant. He raised his hand, cutting him off. "What happens between my daughter and me is none of your business, Michael. And if you want to keep working here, I suggest you control your son. This is your last chance." Francis's threatening tone was clear. He turned and walked away, leaving behind a heavy silence. Michael, now alone with Donovan and Marina, approached the two. "You have to be careful," Michael warned, looking from Donovan to Marina. "Francis won't give up on this, and he's a powerful man. We need to be smart about what we're going to do from now on." Donovan knew his father was right, but the feeling of helplessness gnawed at him. Francis was cornering them, and the fear of losing everything they had built began to take root. Marina, on the other hand, though she felt the pain of seeing her family fragmenting, wouldn't allow Francis to destroy her love for Donovan. She was willing to fight, even if it meant defying her own blood. The afternoon heat enveloped the Phillips estate, with the soft sound of the wind swaying the leaves of the trees and the murmur of the distant stream. There, hidden in a clearing that had been the scene of so many childhood adventures, Donovan and Marina met once again in secret, far from the prying eyes of the workers and, most importantly, Francis. Time seemed to stand still when they were together, and despite everything happening around them, their love grew, as did the intensity of their encounters. Sitting in the shade of a tree that had witnessed many shared moments, Donovan looked at Marina with a nostalgic smile on his lips. "Do you remember when we were kids, running through these fields without a care in the world?" he asked, his voice full of memories. Marina smiled, gently touching Donovan's hand. She too remembered those days perfectly, when the world seemed simple, free of social obligations and family expectations. At that time, the only thing that mattered was the pure friendship they shared, a connection that already hinted at something deeper. "Of course I remember," Marina replied, her eyes shining. "I never thought that one day we'd be here like this, with so many things keeping us from being happy." Donovan squeezed her hand, determined. He knew things were much more complicated now, but he also knew he couldn't give up on what he felt for Marina. The two had grown up together, and the love that had developed between them was real, something no threat could erase. Francis might be powerful and relentless, but Donovan was willing to face it all to be by Marina's side. "I won't lose you," he said with conviction. "No matter what your father does, we'll fight for this. We'll get married, Marina. We don't need anyone's approval." Donovan's words filled Marina with hope, though the fear of going against her father still lingered. She knew Francis was capable of terrible things, and the rumors circulating around the estate about his shady dealings only fueled her suspicions. Still, the love she felt for Donovan made her feel braver. The decision was made. They would marry, and nothing would stop that from happening. From that day on, they began to plan the wedding in secret. They knew that any misstep could cost them dearly, and they needed to be careful. They decided it would be a simple ceremony, something intimate, far from the judgmental eyes of the high society that surrounded Marina's family. What mattered was the commitment they were about to make to each other, a commitment that transcended any social convention. Meanwhile, memories of childhood days often resurfaced. It was impossible for Donovan not to recall the early moments with Marina, when she was still just a girl running through the fields, laughing carefree. For Marina, the admiration she had always felt for Donovan, for his intelligence and kindness, had only grown over the years. Now, he was not just the boy who accompanied her in games, but the man she was willing to fight for against all odds. While the couple continued with their secret plans, dark rumors about Francis began to gain traction on the estate. The workers whispered about suspicious business deals and Francis's involvement with dangerous people. Mysterious disappearances of workers and outsiders began to draw attention, and although Marina already had her suspicions about her father, she refused to believe he could be involved in something so terrible. For his part, Donovan listened to these stories with growing concern. He knew that Francis was not only an influential businessman, but also someone capable of ruthless acts to protect his interests. Even so, the love he felt for Marina pushed him to move forward, despite all the danger surrounding them. Michael, always attentive to his son, began to notice the change in Donovan. Although the young man tried to hide it, it was evident that something was deeply troubling him. One night, while they were back in the workers' house, Michael decided to confront Donovan about what was going on. "Donovan, you need to think carefully," Michael said, his voice laden with concern. "I know you love Marina, but challenging her is one thing. Challenging her father is another. Francis isn't an ordinary man. If what they say about him is true, you could be getting yourself into something very dangerous." Donovan listened to his father's words, knowing he was right, but the decision had already been made. He couldn't turn back. The love he felt for Marina was stronger than any threat. "Dad, I know the risks, but I can't give up on her. Marina and I will get married no matter what happens," Donovan said firmly, looking his father in the eye. Michael sighed, realizing there was no way to convince his son to back down. He knew Donovan well and knew that once the young man made a decision, there was nothing that would change his mind. However, the worry still gnawed at Michael's heart. He feared that the consequences of this forbidden love would be far more serious than Donovan could imagine. As the days passed, Donovan and Marina's meetings became even more secretive. They knew that any slip could ruin everything, but they were determined to move forward with their plans. The marriage would be the first step toward a new life, away from Francis's impositions and threats. However, tension on the estate continued to mount. Francis seemed increasingly watchful, and the rumors about his illicit dealings circulated more intensely. Even so, Donovan and Marina remained steadfast in their decision, determined to fight for the love they had cultivated since childhood. They were ready to face whatever came their way, but they knew the road would be full of obstacles. The battle was just beginning, and the future was uncertain. The sun shone high over the Phillips estate on the day of Donovan and Marina's wedding, but the heavy atmosphere among those present contrasted with the clear sky. The ceremony, though organized simply at the request of the couple, took place on Marina's family property, which seemed like bitter irony to many of the guests. There, among the large halls and the vast garden where the reception was about to begin, whispers of disdain and judgmental looks prevailed. The union between Marina, the daughter of one of the most powerful men in the region, and Donovan, the humble young man who had worked on the estate since childhood, was the subject of gossip among the high society guests. Many barely disguised their criticism, murmuring about how Marina had ruined her future by marrying someone of such a lower class. Even so, she held her head high, her gaze steady at Donovan's side. He, on the other hand, was visibly tense but determined to go through with it. They both knew that this marriage was an affront to the status quo, a declaration that their love was worth more than any social difference. The ceremony took place in a strange atmosphere, with a mixture of attentive looks and forced smiles. In the background, Francis watched everything with an impenetrable expression. He had never accepted this marriage, but giving in to Marina's will had been the only way to avoid a definitive break with his daughter. Even so, his presence there was a constant reminder that not everything was at peace. The tension between Francis and Donovan was almost palpable, and Michael, always at his son's side, felt the weight of every judgment-laden look. After the ceremony, the guests gathered in the grand hall for the reception. The atmosphere, which should have been celebratory, was an uncomfortable mix of formalities and barely disguised murmurs. The impeccable decor and soft music didn't seem enough to ease the tense mood. Marina, radiant in her wedding dress, tried to ignore the malicious comments, while Donovan silently bore the weight of that judgment. In the middle of the reception, Michael was invited to give a speech in honor of the couple. Though he wasn't a man of many words, he knew that this moment was important. He stood, visibly nervous but with the pride of a father seeing his son marry the woman he loved. As he prepared to speak, everyone's attention shifted to him. "I just want to say that—" Michael began hesitantly, his voice heavy with emotion. But before he could continue, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed through the hall. A woman, with a serious and determined expression, pushed through the crowd. It was Isabel, a former estate employee who had been fired years ago, apparently without reason. Her face was tense, and her eyes shone with a mix of bravery and indignation. "Wait!" Isabel exclaimed, interrupting Michael's speech. The hall, which had been filled with the murmurs of guests, fell into a sudden and heavy silence. Francis, sitting in the back, stood up, visibly uncomfortable with Isabel's unexpected presence. Marina, next to Donovan, frowned, not understanding what was about to happen. Donovan's heart raced, sensing that something serious was about to unfold. "I couldn't stay silent any longer," Isabel continued, her voice firm. "Everyone here needs to know the truth about Mr. Francis Phillips." The tension in the air intensified, and murmurs began to spread rapidly among the guests. Francis tried to intervene, but Isabel was quicker. "For years, I worked on this estate and saw things that left me with doubts, until I finally discovered what was really happening," she said, looking directly at Francis, who was now pale. "Mr. Phillips is involved with organized crime. He's responsible for several disappearances that have occurred in the region. And when I discovered the truth, he tried to bribe me, and when I refused, I was fired." Shock rippled through the hall. All eyes were now fixed on Francis, whose mask of control was finally beginning to crack. Marina, hearing Isabel's words, felt as if the ground had opened beneath her feet. She had always had her suspicions about her father, but she had never imagined something so terrible. "This is absurd!" Francis shouted, trying to regain control of the situation. "This woman is lying. She was fired for incompetence and is trying to slander me." However, Isabel didn't back down. "I'm not lying," she said defiantly, "and besides, the police are here to prove it." At that moment, a group of men who had seemed like just more of the many guests stood up. They were undercover police officers who approached Francis with serious expressions. "Mr. Francis Phillips, you are under arrest," one of the officers said, showing his badge. "We have enough evidence to incriminate you for your crimes. You've been under investigation for months." Chaos erupted in the hall. The guests, in shock, distanced themselves from Francis as if he were an imminent danger. Marina, paralyzed, watched the scene, unable to process what was happening. The man she had called father, who had controlled her life and the estate with an iron fist, was now being unmasked as a criminal. Seeing himself cornered, Francis didn't resist. He simply bowed his head, as if knowing the noose had tightened. As he was led away by the police, he looked at Marina, but this time there was no arrogance in his eyes. There was only a heavy silence of someone who knew their downfall was sealed. Donovan, still beside Marina, held her hand. He knew that this moment would change their lives forever. What should have been the happiest day of their lives had turned into a public nightmare. But at the same time, he knew that in some way, this was a new beginning. A turbulent start, yes, but a path toward freedom. Michael, still standing, lowered his head, feeling the pain of seeing the devastation on Francis's daughter's face. Donovan and Marina's marriage hadn't just united two souls in love. It had also revealed dark secrets that would reverberate for a long time. With Francis being taken away, the hall was left in an uncomfortable silence. And in the midst of the emotional chaos, Donovan and Marina now faced a new future, more challenging and uncertain than ever. The tense silence that followed Francis's arrest seemed to hang over everyone present like a storm about to break. The man who had controlled not only his family, but also the lives of countless workers and citizens in the region for so many years, was now bowed, handcuffed, and defeated. He offered no resistance, aware that his empire had irreversibly collapsed. The guests looked on with incredulous gazes, unable to believe that the once powerful Francis Phillips, a man of almost untouchable influence, had fallen so easily. Donovan, standing beside Marina, watched the scene with a mixture of relief and apprehension. This was the moment when the truth was finally coming to light, but it was also the starting point for something much more complex and dangerous. The future they had planned together was now stained by scandal and dark secrets. Marina, for her part, still seemed paralyzed. Her legs trembled and the air felt heavier than ever. Isabel's words echoed in her mind. The devastating revelation about her father was harder to process with each passing second. The image of Francis, handcuffed and led away by the police, was something she had never imagined witnessing. "I knew something was wrong, but this?" Marina murmured, unable to take her eyes off her father. Donovan held her tightly, trying to convey a sense of security in the midst of the emotional chaos unfolding. He knew that Marina was broken inside, but now, more than ever, they needed to think about their safety and what might happen next. "Marina, I know it's hard," he said softly, moving closer to her. "But we need to act quickly. Your father may have surrendered, but there are other people involved. We don't know what else could happen." Marina blinked several times, trying to focus on Donovan's words. He was right. Francis's involvement with organized crime meant he wasn't alone, and with his downfall, other members of his network might seek revenge. Fear began to take hold of her, not for what had happened to her father, but for what could happen to her and the people she loved. Michael, who had been observing everything from a distance, approached with a deeply concerned expression. He knew that Francis's arrest was only the beginning of a long and difficult road for all of them. The mafia that Francis was involved with wouldn't simply let the situation unfold without interference. "We need to get out of here," Michael said urgently. "This place is no longer safe. If Francis was really involved with dangerous people, they'll come after what he values most. And you too are the next targets." Those words fell like a stone on Marina, who finally allowed herself to cry. Silent tears ran down her face as the world around her seemed to crumble. The image of her father, the rigid and until now invincible man, now disgraced, mixed with the fear of what might come next. She had felt controlled by him her entire life, but ironically, now that he no longer had control over anything, the danger seemed greater than ever. Realizing Marina's state, Donovan pulled her close, hugging her tightly. He knew that the love they had shared for so many years would now be tested like never before. But most of all, he knew they needed to leave as quickly as possible. "Let's go home," Donovan said, looking at his father and then at Marina. "We'll take what we need and leave before anything worse happens." Marina nodded, still in tears but determined. She knew that fleeing was the only sensible option at this point. There was no longer any room for illusions about what could be done to salvage her family's reputation or ensure their safety here. They needed a fresh start, far from all this, as the police organized Francis's arrest and tried to control the unrest among the guests. Donovan, Marina, and Michael discreetly left the hall. The atmosphere of tension still lingered in the air, and whispers continued to circulate among the guests. But no one seemed to pay attention to the three. The only thing that mattered now was leaving the estate and ensuring their safety. When they reached the small house where Donovan and Michael lived, the weight of the situation finally settled on them. There was little time to gather their belongings, and Donovan knew that every minute was crucial. Michael quickly began packing essential items, while Marina, still trembling, tried to process everything that had happened. "We're going to be okay, Marina," Donovan said, trying to calm her as he packed a few suitcases. "I know this feels like a nightmare right now, but we'll find a way to get through this." Marina nodded, still in shock. She looked around, seeing how the world she had known since childhood was falling apart in just a few hours. The estate, the high society friends, her own father. Everything that had once seemed unchangeable had vanished. Now, the only thing left was the hope that they could start anew, far from this place marked by so much suffering. With everything ready, the three of them left the house quickly, trying not to attract attention. The sun was beginning to set on the horizon, and the impending darkness seemed a reflection of the uncertainty hanging over their lives. The Phillips estate, which for so long had symbolized power and prestige, was now the scene of a public and shameful collapse. Francis had fallen, but the echo of his actions still reverberated. The road ahead would be filled with challenges and dangers, but united, Donovan, Marina, and Michael knew they could face whatever came. There was no turning back now. The road seemed endless as Donovan, Marina, and Michael headed into the unknown. The car rocked gently along the rural roads, but the silence between them was deep, almost palpable. Each of the three carried their own thoughts, their own worries. The life they had known until now was behind them, dissolving as the horizon changed. After the chaos that followed Francis's arrest, there was no other option but to flee. Donovan knew that with Francis's involvement in organized crime, the threats went far beyond his father-in-law. Even in prison, Francis still had allies and accomplices scattered throughout the region, and his downfall could result in retaliation against those closest to him. The only way out was to seek help. It was Michael who suggested they turn to the police. He knew that with the revelations made by Isabel, the authorities now had enough evidence to launch a deeper investigation into Francis's criminal network. But beyond that, Michael hoped the police could guarantee the family's safety. They needed to disappear, and that's exactly what they did. After a long conversation with the police investigating the case, Donovan, Marina, and Michael were placed under the Witness Protection Program. Their identities were erased, replaced by new lives, new names, and a new state far from anywhere they could be recognized. Now living under the name Victor, Donovan faced the challenge of rebuilding his life alongside Marina, who was now called Clara. Michael, now known as Samuel, accompanied them, knowing that the family bond would be the only anchor in the midst of so many uncertainties. The small town they were assigned to offered the peace they had sought, but it also brought with it the constant fear of being discovered. Marina, now Clara, struggled to accept everything she had lost. Sitting in the small rented house they now called home, she spent hours gazing out the window, trying to come to terms with her father's betrayal. Francis, the man who had shaped her life with rigidity and control, was now a shadow of everything she had once believed. Accepting that he wasn't just a cold man but also a criminal was something that broke her heart a little more each day. "I never thought we'd live like this," she said one night, her voice a whisper in the silence. Donovan, or Victor, watched her closely. He knew that for her, the transformation had been deeper. Marina had grown up in a world of privilege, surrounded by comfort and security, and now all of that had vanished like smoke. It wasn't just the end of her previous life, but a break with her own roots. The name Clara symbolized that distance, a new identity she still struggled to inhabit. "I know it's not easy," Donovan replied, sitting beside her and taking her hand. "But we're in this together, and despite everything that's happened, we still have the chance to build something new, something real, away from all the lies." Clara turned to him, and for a moment a faint smile appeared on her lips. It was true. The love between them hadn't been shaken, even in the face of adversity. Donovan, or Victor, was the only anchor in her new life, the only reference point in the midst of chaos. The bond between them had grown even stronger, a force that pushed them forward despite the constant fear of being found. Weeks passed slowly, and over time they began to adapt to the new routine. The small town was peaceful, and life there seemed simple. Victor found work at a local workshop, while Clara helped in a small convenience store. Samuel, whose health was somewhat weakened, did odd jobs for neighbors and worked hard to maintain normalcy in their lives. However, even in the midst of the apparent tranquility, the fear never completely left them. Clara, in particular, felt the weight of uncertainty. Every time a stranger entered the store, she wondered if they could be Francis's accomplices, or if someone from the past had recognized them. Every unknown car that passed by their street at night made her heart race, and the nights were often disturbed by nightmares of chases and trials. "Will we ever feel safe again?" she asked Donovan on one of those nights as they lay in silence in the small bed they shared. "I hope so, Clara," Donovan responded, not hesitating to use her new name as a way to reinforce their new beginning. "But in the meantime, we need to believe we're doing the best we can. The important thing is that we're together, and no one can take that away from us." Despite the fear, it was true that the days brought small hopes. The couple grew stronger, finding comfort in each other's company. Though Clara still mourned the loss of her old life, the love between her and Donovan blossomed in new ways. They were more united than ever, and adversity only strengthened their commitment to one another. Samuel, for his part, watched the young couple with wisdom. He knew that this phase of their lives would be a test of emotional and mental resilience. Sometimes Michael thought about Francis, the man he had worked for all those years, and wondered how things could have been different if his former boss had chosen another path. But life, as he well knew, rarely followed the course we desired. As the months went by, the constant fear of being found began to diminish, though it never completely disappeared. Little by little, the improvised family began to build a new routine, a new sense of normalcy, though precariously balanced between apparent security and invisible risk. Clara, though still haunted by her father's decisions, began to accept that this was her new life. She had lost a father, a home, and a history, but she had found something more valuable, an opportunity to start over with the man she loved. Donovan, always steadfast, had promised to protect her at all costs, and that promise was all she needed to keep moving forward. In the small living room of their new house, Clara looked at Donovan with gratitude and love. They had weathered so many storms, but despite everything, they were still standing. And maybe that was enough. The life they had once known was behind them, but ahead lay a future that they would begin to build together. Years passed, and the joyful sound of children's laughter filled the small country house as 5-year-old Maria Alice ran around the room, playing with her toys. The day was sunny, and the window let in a gentle breeze that carried the fresh scent of flowers from the garden. Clara, now accustomed to her new identity, looked lovingly at her daughter as she gently stroked her belly. She was pregnant with her second child, and the peace that now enveloped her family was a balm after years of uncertainty and fear. Victor, the man who had once been Donovan, sat on the porch, gazing at the landscape with the calm expression of someone who had finally found stability. Life in the small town had been kind to them. Far from the spotlight of the past, from the constant tension and threats that had once pursued them, they had managed to build something solid. Time had brought calm, and the simple but love-filled routine marked their days. Michael, now Samuel, had also found well-deserved peace. Though years of hard work and past worries had left marks on his body, he was grateful to be there, surrounded by his family, watching as love blossomed between Donovan and Marina, or rather, Victor and Clara. He knew it wasn't easy to start over, but he also knew that their love and courage were the foundation on which everything was built. The small living room, decorated simply, was the heart of the house. Clara, with her hand resting on her pregnant belly, sat on the sofa, her eyes wandering to the television, which was turned off. Since they had begun their new life there, she had tried to distance herself from any memory of the past. However, that morning, something changed. The news she had feared had finally arrived. Her father, Francis's trial, would be broadcast on television. Victor entered the room and noticed Clara's distant gaze, immediately recognizing what was troubling her. He knew the trial was an event she couldn't avoid, no matter how painful it was. "Do you want to watch it?" he asked gently, sitting beside her. Clara hesitated for a moment. Watching the trial meant facing the ghosts of the past once and for all. It meant seeing the man who had raised her, who had controlled her life for so many years, answer for the crimes he had committed. It was an inevitable confrontation, but also a painful one. "I think I need to see it," Clara sighed. "I don't know if I'm ready, but I can't ignore what's happening." Victor nodded, understanding the depth of her decision. He knew that Francis's trial wasn't just about justice being served, but also about closing a painful chapter for Clara. With a deep sigh, Clara turned on the television. The image that appeared on the screen was that of a crowded courtroom, and at the center of it all was Francis. The man who had once been imposing, who had wielded so much power and control, now sat before a judge, aged and with the expression of someone carrying the weight of the world on their shoulders. The cameras zoomed in on his face, and Clara, without looking away, felt a whirlwind of emotions. She was pregnant, happy, rebuilding a life alongside Donovan and little Maria Alice. Yet seeing Francis there, in the defendant's chair, brought back all the memories of her old life with force. The father she had loved and feared, who had controlled every step of her life, was now facing the consequences of his actions. But more than anything, Clara knew that this trial wasn't just about crimes. It was about the betrayal of a father and the weight of a past she was trying to forget. Silent tears rolled down her face as she watched the scene. It wasn't sadness for the man Francis had become. He had made his choices, and now he was facing the results of them. What hurt Clara was the loss of the idea of what he could have been. The father figure she had always longed for, the security he should have provided, had been distorted by ambition and crime. Sensing Clara's emotional turmoil, Victor wrapped her in a comforting embrace, holding her tenderly. He knew that no matter how painful the past was, they were building something new and beautiful together. Their love was proof that the future could be different, brighter. As they watched the trial in silence, Maria Alice continued playing happily in the living room, completely unaware of what was happening on the television. To her, Francis was nothing more than a stranger, someone she had never heard of, an irrelevant figure in her young life. She grew up surrounded by love and security, never knowing that the man on trial for such serious crimes was actually her grandfather. Clara looked at her daughter for a moment, feeling a mix of relief and sadness. Relief because Maria Alice would never know the weight of that past, and sadness because, deep down, Clara still mourned what her family could have been. She wiped her tears and looked at Victor, realizing just how much they had accomplished together. "We made the right decision," she said, her voice still shaky. "No matter what happened, what my father did, we're building something new, something real." Victor smiled, nodding in silence. He knew that the past would always be a part of them, but he also knew that what truly mattered was what they were building together. The future lay ahead of them, with all its promises and hopes. Clara glanced once more at the television. Francis was now speaking, answering the judge's questions, but she could no longer focus on his words. He was no longer the man who had once controlled her. Now, he was just a shadow of the past. She turned off the television, feeling a lightness she hadn't experienced in years. The trial would take its course and justice would be served, but for Clara, the most important thing was that she was finally free. Her new life, her new family, was what truly mattered. Maria Alice laughed, calling for her parents' attention with her joyful play. Clara and Victor looked at each other and smiled. The past was finally where it belonged, behind them. Now, all that remained was the present, full of love and hope and a future they would build together. I hope you enjoyed today's story. If you did, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought about the story. See you in the next video.